Before we begin this journey, if you enjoy stories of love, redemption, and second chances, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more captivating tales like this one. The autumn rain traced delicate patterns down the towering windows of Hartley House as London's most distinguished families gathered within its opulent walls. Inside the grand drawing room, 1,000 candles blazed from crystal chandeliers, their light catching on jewelry and silverware, transforming the space into something almost magical. The year was 1832, and society moved with the careful choreography of those who understood that every gesture, every word, carried weight and consequence that could elevate or destroy a reputation in mere moments. Marcus Ashford stood near the marble fireplace, one hand resting against the mantelpiece with practiced ease, surveying the assembled company with barely concealed boredom. At 30 years of age, the Duke of Blackridge possessed everything society deemed valuable. Wealth beyond measure, a title that opened every door in England, dark, handsome features that made ambitious mothers push their daughters forward at every opportunity, and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings with the precision of a master strategist. His evening dress was impeccable, as befitted his rank, though he wore his ducal authority with an ease that suggested he considered it more burden than blessing. The conversations swirling around him held absolutely no interest. Weather predictions that anyone with eyes could make, scandal-mongering about people whose lives were infinitely less interesting than the gossips believed, discussions of who was courting whom with all the strategic calculation of military campaigns. It all blurred into meaningless noise, a symphony of superficiality that Marcus had endured at hundreds of these gatherings. He had performed his ducal duties with appropriate grace for over a decade, and with each passing season he felt increasingly hollow, increasingly aware that there had to be more to existence than this endless parade of superficial interactions and strategic social maneuvering designed to advance family positions and secure advantageous marriages. Then, Lady Cecilia Montfort appeared at his elbow, and the evening transformed entirely. She wore emerald silk that complemented her dark hair and eyes remarkably well, though Marcus noted with immediate approval that she had eschewed the excessive frills and flourishes favored by most young women of their class. There was an elegance to her appearance that spoke of confidence rather than ostentation, of a woman who knew her own mind and cared little for following trends simply because others deemed them fashionable. A simple strand of pearls, her grandmother's he knew from previous conversations, adorned her neck. But it was her expression that truly captured his attention in that moment, amusement mixed with keen intelligence, as though she could read his thoughts of escape and found them both entirely understandable and thoroughly entertaining. Their friendship had developed over nearly 2 years of chance encounters at various social functions, slowly building from polite acknowledgement to genuine enjoyment of each other's company. Unlike other women of his acquaintance, Cecilia never simpered or flattered or used the calculated feminine wiles that Marcus found so tedious. She challenged him intellectually, engaged in spirited debates that left him energized rather than exhausted, and treated his title as incidental rather than defining. In her company, Marcus felt less like a duke performing a carefully rehearsed role and more like himself, whoever that might actually be beneath all the social conditioning and expectation that had been layered onto him since birth. Cecilia commented on his obvious desire to flee the gathering, her voice warm with barely suppressed laughter, and Marcus found himself genuinely smiling, not the polite expression he manufactured for social occasions, but real amusement that came from being understood by someone who valued honesty over propriety. He admitted his calculations regarding possible escape routes, and she informed him with mock seriousness that their hostess had positioned herself near the entrance like a particularly determined sentinel, making departure impossible without causing the kind of offense that would reverberate through London society for weeks. What followed was precisely the kind of exchange Marcus valued most in his increasingly monotonous existence. Substantive conversation about matters of genuine importance rather than the vapid small talk that dominated most social gatherings. Cecilia steered their discussion toward the proposed Factory Act amendments, legislation designed to limit working hours for women and children in the increasingly industrialized economy that was transforming England from an agricultural nation into a manufacturing powerhouse. This was the sort of topic polite society deemed inappropriate for dinner parties, which naturally made it exactly what interested them both, two people who found the constraints of social convention more suffocating than liberating. Marcus listened as Cecilia outlined her position with passionate conviction that animated her entire being. The current conditions in factories were utterly disgraceful. She argued with the kind of moral clarity that came from genuine research rather than fashionable concern. Children as young as 7 or 8 labored 14 hours daily in dangerous environments, losing fingers to machinery, developing lung diseases from textile dust, living lives of desperate poverty despite their families' constant work. Any civilized society should protect its most vulnerable members rather than exploiting them for profit, she insisted, her dark eyes flashing with indignation that Marcus found utterly captivating even as he prepared to take the contrary position. He suggested deliberately that interfering with commerce created unintended consequences, reduced production, increased prices, factories closing and throwing even more families into destitution. Sentiment, however noble, could not feed hungry families, he argued, knowing full well that this position would provoke her most animated and articulate responses. Marcus was thoroughly enjoying himself now, watching as Cecilia's cheeks flushed with the passion of her convictions as she marshaled her arguments with the precision of a military commander. Deploying forces on a battlefield. She never wilted under his opposition, but seemed to grow more passionate and articulate with each exchange. She spoke of fair wages that would allow adults to support families without forcing children into labor, questioned whether profit margins held more value than human life, challenged his apparent belief that exploitation represented the natural order rather than a moral failure that legislation could and should address. Their debate intensified, voices rising slightly above the gentle murmur of polite conversation, drawing the attention of other guests who watched with expressions ranging from scandalized delight to genuine horror that a young lady would speak so forcefully to a duke that she would dare to challenge his positions with such fearlessness and intellectual rigor. When Cecilia suggested he actually visit a factory to witness conditions firsthand before dismissing protective legislation, Marcus felt a surge of admiration so powerful it caught him off guard, made him aware of her, in ways that went beyond mere intellectual appreciation. They stood facing each other, both breathing quickly, the air between them crackling with intellectual energy, and something else neither would have named or acknowledged. Marcus was acutely aware that every eye in the drawing room had fixed upon them, that their hostess appeared agitated and prepared to intervene before scandal erupted, that he should probably diffuse this situation before it escalated beyond the bounds of acceptable social discourse. Instead, overcome by champagne and genuine affection for this maddening, brilliant woman who challenged him in ways no one else dared, Marcus laughed aloud and declared in a voice that carried across the suddenly silent room that only she would dare speak to him thus, that this was precisely why she would make an excellent wife, someone to challenge his thinking and keep him honest through decades of marriage. Then, with spectacular thoughtlessness born of the moment's intensity, he asked if she would marry him, the words emerging as jest, as a way to acknowledge their spirited exchange and the absurdity of their public disagreement that had entertained and scandalized their audience in equal measure. But even as the words left his lips, Marcus recognized his catastrophic error with the clarity of a man watching his own execution unfold. Cecilia's expression transformed instantly, devastatingly. The fierce debater disappeared, replaced by a woman whose eyes suddenly shone with joy and disbelief, whose hand flew to her throat with fingers trembling against her pearls. She faltered, struggling to find words, then smiled with such radiant happiness that Marcus felt his stomach drop sickeningly. She said she thought he would never ask, that finally this moment had arrived. The drawing room erupted into absolute chaos. Lady Hartley shrieked with delight loud enough to be heard in the servants' quarters. Several young ladies burst into tears, whether from joy at witnessing such romance or disappointment at losing an eligible duke. Marcus could not determine through his growing panic. Cecilia's father, the Earl of Montford, surged forward from across the room where he had been engaged in conversation about agricultural yields, his weathered face breaking into an enormous smile as he clasped Marcus's hand in both of his own and pumped it vigorously with the enthusiasm of a man whose fondest hopes had just been realized. Lord Montfort declared he had hoped for such an outcome, but dared not presume that this was wonderful news, absolutely wonderful, that he could not be more delighted to welcome the Duke of Blackridge as his son-in-law. Marcus opened his mouth to explain, to clarify that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that his proposal had been merely a joke made in the heat of spirited debate, but the words refused to come. How could he announce before this assembly of society's most prominent members that his proposal had been merely a jest? How could he humiliate Cecilia so publicly, revealing that her joyful acceptance was based on a cruel misunderstanding that would mark her as either foolish or desperate in the eyes of everyone present? Cecilia moved to her father's side, her face glowing with happiness that seemed to radiate from her very being, illuminating her features with a joy that Marcus had never before witnessed in her. She glanced at Marcus, and in her eyes he saw not just happiness but hope, and beneath that, a vulnerability that suggested this moment meant far more to her than he had ever imagined possible. She confessed to being quite overcome, to being taken entirely by surprise despite their years of friendship. Lady Hartley swooped in, her substantial form quivering with excitement as she proclaimed the proposal romantic and wonderfully unconventional, declaring that who would have imagined the Duke of Blackridge possessed such passionate nature, declaring his intentions before all of society rather than through the traditional private channels. Marcus stood frozen, trapped by the consequences of his own recklessness, feeling the walls of obligation closing in around him with each passing second. Around him, well-wishers pressed close, offering congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity, speculating about wedding dates with the eagerness of those who love to be first with significant social news, already calculating the implications of this unexpected alliance between the powerful Blackridge Duchy and the respected but less wealthy Montfort earldom. The Earl of Montfort was beaming, his pride and joy evident in every line of his face, in the way he kept glancing between his daughter and her new fiancé, as though hardly able to believe his fortune. Cecilia herself seemed transported to some realm of happiness Marcus had never before witnessed in her, and he had done this with a thoughtless jest, with words spoken in admiration and amusement that he never intended as genuine proposal. Cecilia's soft voice cut through the cacophony, asking if he was quite well, noting that he seemed pale, and Marcus forced himself to smile, to take her hand in his for the first time beyond the formality of a dance or offering an arm for escort. Her fingers were slender and warm, trembling slightly in his grasp, and the trust in her touch, the happiness that seemed to radiate from her very being, struck Marcus like a physical blow to his chest. In all their months of friendship, all their spirited debates and shared laughter, all the hours spent in animated conversation about politics and philosophy and reform, he had been blind to what now seemed painfully obvious. Cecilia's feelings for him went far deeper than mere friendship, far beyond intellectual companionship, and he had just entrapped her in an engagement based on a moment of foolish levity that he could not now retract without destroying her completely before the very people whose good opinion mattered most in their world. The carriage wheels echoed against the wet cobblestones as Marcus rode through the darkened streets of London, each rotation carrying him further from the Montfort residence and deeper into the consequences of what he had done. The autumn rain had finally stopped, leaving the city glistening under the gas lamps like a stage set for tragedy. Inside the carriage, Marcus sat rigid, replaying the evening's events with growing horror. The moment Cecilia's face had transformed from fierce debater to radiant bride-to-be played endlessly in his mind, a loop of joy built on deception that he had been too cowardly to correct. Blackridge House stood silent and imposing when he arrived, its windows dark except for the entrance hall where servants waited to attend their master. Marcus waved them away, wanting no witness to the turmoil consuming him. He made his way directly to his study, a room lined floor to ceiling, with books on philosophy, history, and political theory. These volumes represented years of cultivating his mind, of valuing logic and reason above emotion and sentiment. Yet tonight, all that careful intellectual development seemed worthless in the face of what his thoughtless words had wrought. The whiskey decanter became his sole companion as the hours crept toward dawn. Marcus paced the Persian carpets, his dress shoes leaving impressions in the thick pile as he traced the same path again and again. He considered every possible solution, every way he might extricate himself and Cecilia from this disaster without causing irreparable harm. Writing to her immediately seemed the obvious choice. But each time he sat at his mahogany desk and took up his pen, the words refused to come. How did one commit such a confession to paper? The very idea of reducing this catastrophe to ink on parchment felt like compounding the original insult. By the time his valet arrived at 8 in the morning to prepare him for the day, Marcus had consumed half the decanter and made no progress whatsoever toward a solution. His reflection in the shaving mirror revealed a man who looked like he had spent the night in dissipation. Dark circles under his eyes and a general appearance of exhaustion that would certainly fuel speculation about an eager bridegroom. The irony was not lost on him. The secretary, Mr. Peaton, arrived shortly after with an armful of newspapers and a substantial stack of calling cards. The engagement announcement had appeared in every major publication, just as Marcus had feared. Lord Montfort had wasted no time making the betrothal official and public, ensuring his daughter's advantageous match was secured before any possibility of the Duke reconsidering. Among the calling cards was one from the Earl himself, expressing his desire to discuss marriage settlements at Marcus's earliest convenience. The request sent a fresh wave of panic through Marcus's already churning stomach. Settlements meant financial arrangements, legal documents, the formal machinery that would bind this engagement in contracts and obligations far beyond social expectation. Marcus instructed Peaton to inform all callers that he was not at home, a cowardly delay tactic that bought him time, but solved nothing. He could not face Lord Montfort, a man he genuinely respected, while harboring this deception. He needed to speak with Cecilia first, to find some way to explain the unexplainable. The morning dragged with excruciating slowness. Marcus attempted to occupy himself with estate correspondence and parliamentary business, but his concentration was shattered. Every document he picked up blurred before his eyes, replaced by the memory of Cecilia's face, the trust shining in her gaze, the happiness radiating from her very being. He had given her that joy with his careless jest, and now he would have to take it away, revealing himself not merely as foolish, but as cruel. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor who refused to be turned away. Lady Eleanor Sinclair, Marcus's younger sister, swept into his study with the force of a storm system, her amber silk gown rustling with indignation. At 26, Eleanor had been married for 4 years to a baronet she genuinely esteemed, which gave her opinions on romantic matters a weight Marcus could not easily dismiss. She wasted no time with pleasantries, informing her brother that he was an absolute fool. She had just come from visiting Lady Cecilia Montfort, his betrothed in case he had somehow forgotten, and found her in a state of such radiant happiness that Eleanor felt physically ill knowing the truth behind it. Cecilia had spoken of Marcus with genuine affection and joy at the prospect of becoming his wife, believing every word of his proposal to be sincere. But Eleanor knew her brother, had seen that expression of abject horror poorly concealed across the drawing room at the Hartley dinner. She understood exactly what had happened. Marcus saw no point in denying it. He confirmed that the proposal had been meant as a jest, an impulsive compliment born of admiration during their debate, never intended as a genuine offer of marriage. But Cecilia had accepted before he could clarify, and then her father arrived with all of London society bearing witness, and Marcus had been unable to bring himself to humiliate her publicly by revealing the misunderstanding. So he had allowed the deception to continue, thinking he would find some private way to explain, but with each passing hour the trap had only drawn tighter. Eleanor pressed him with the question that truly mattered. Did he care for Cecilia at all, beyond mere friendship? Marcus considered carefully before responding. He valued Cecilia's friendship above nearly all others. She was intelligent, witty, fearless in her convictions. She challenged him intellectually in ways no other woman of his acquaintance did. He enjoyed her company immensely. But when Eleanor asked directly whether he loved Cecilia, Marcus had to admit he had not thought of her in romantic terms. She had been his friend for nearly 2 years, someone with whom he could debate and discuss. Marriage and romantic love were simply not categories he had associated with her. Eleanor's response was blunt and unsparing. She called him an idiot, pointing out that she had observed them together on numerous occasions and seen the way Marcus lit up when Cecilia entered a room, the way he sought her out in company, the way he laughed, genuinely at her wit. Most men would recognize these as signs of deeper feeling, but Marcus in his arrogance had assumed friendship was the ceiling of his regard rather than merely its foundation. The accusation struck home because Marcus could not entirely dismiss it. Had he been blind to his own feelings, so caught up in the comfortable safety of friendship that he failed to recognize something more? Even if Eleanor was right, it did not change the fundamental problem. Cecilia believed he had proposed out of genuine romantic feeling. To marry her while allowing her to persist in that belief would be to build their entire marriage on a lie. Eleanor told him simply to tell Cecilia the truth, but Marcus protested that doing so would break her heart and humiliate her before all of society. He had seen the joy in her face and understood what this engagement meant to her. How could he destroy that? His sister leaned forward with intensity, arguing that the alternative was worse. If Marcus married Cecilia while harboring this secret, what would happen when she eventually discovered the truth? And she would discover it. Secrets of this magnitude always emerged. Then he would have not merely wounded her, but betrayed her trust completely. The logic was inescapable. Eleanor was right. Perpetuating the deception would only compound the original injury. But the thought of confessing now, of revealing the cruel joke at the heart of this engagement, seemed equally impossible. For perhaps the first time in his life, Marcus admitted complete defeat. He was utterly at a loss, with no clear path forward and no solution that would not cause tremendous harm. Eleanor told him what he must do, though he would not like it. He must go to Lady Cecilia and tell her the truth, all of it, how the proposal came about, why he did not correct the misunderstanding immediately, and what his true feelings were insofar as he understood them. He must give her the choice of how to proceed with full knowledge of the circumstances. Marcus protested that Cecilia would despise him, but Eleanor acknowledged this as a possibility while arguing that at least she would despise him honestly, rather than loving him falsely. She emphasized the urgency of the situation. Every day that passed, every gesture of courtship, every tender word or gift would only make the eventual revelation more devastating. If Marcus cared for Cecilia at all, he would not allow her to sink deeper into this illusion. He knew she was right. The honorable course, the only course, was to confess immediately and face the consequences. But the thought of seeing Cecilia's joy transform into hurt and betrayal, of watching hope die in her eyes, was almost more than he could bear. After his sister departed, Marcus sat alone in his study as afternoon faded into evening. He had committed to confessing the truth the following day, to ending this deception before it could cause further harm. It was the right decision, the only decision a man of honor could make. Yet the prospect filled him with a dread that had nothing to do with his own discomfort and everything to do with genuinely wounding someone for whom he cared deeply. Somewhere beneath the friendship and intellectual companionship, beneath his own blindness and stupidity, there existed real feeling. He recognized that now, perhaps too late. The next morning arrived with gray skies that matched Marcus's mood perfectly. His carriage rolled through London, toward the Montford townhouse in Grosvenor Square, each street bringing him closer to the conversation that would alter both their lives forever. He had rehearsed what he would say dozens of times during another sleepless night, but each version seemed inadequate to the magnitude of his confession. The Montford butler showed him into an elegant morning room where Cecilia rose to greet him, her face lighting with a smile that struck him like a physical blow. She wore a simple morning gown of lavender muslin, her dark hair arranged in soft curls, and she looked young and lovely and entirely too happy to see him. Marcus requested to speak with her privately, and Cecilia agreed, dismissing the butler and seating herself on a small sofa while indicating the space beside her. But Marcus remained standing, unable to bear the intimacy of sitting beside her while preparing to shatter her happiness. He told her he must speak about their engagement, about how it came to pass, and Cecilia's expression shifted from pleasure to puzzlement, asking if something was amiss, if he was having second thoughts. She acknowledged her unconventional nature, but expressed confidence that they would suit well together. Marcus asked her to let him speak, to allow him to finish before responding. He moved to the window, unable to meet her eyes for what he must say. What he was about to tell her would be difficult to hear, and he begged her to allow him to complete his explanation. The quality of silence behind him changed, acquiring a weight that suggested Cecilia had recognized the gravity of his tone. She agreed quietly to listen, and Marcus forced himself to begin. At the Hartley dinner, when he had proposed to her, he paused, gathering his courage before turning to face her. She deserved to see his expression, to judge his sincerity for herself. The words emerged with painful slowness. It had been meant as a jest, a thoughtless joke born of his enjoyment of their debate and his admiration for her passion and intelligence. He had never intended it as a genuine proposal. Of marriage. Marcus watched the words register in her mind, saw understanding dawn in her eyes, followed immediately by confusion and hurt. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale as marble. She repeated his words slowly, barely above a whisper, asking for confirmation that he had proposed to her as a joke. Marcus confirmed this shameful truth, explaining that he had not meant for her to accept, that he thought the absurdity of the situation and the public setting would make clear he was being facetious. But she had responded before he could clarify, and then her father arrived with all of society bearing witness, and Marcus could not bring himself to humiliate her by revealing the truth in that moment. So he had allowed the misunderstanding to continue, thinking he would find some private way to explain, but with each passing hour, the deception only deepened. Cecilia finished his thought with remarkable steadiness, though her hands trembled in her lap. And now he had come to tell her the truth. How very noble of him. The coldness in her tone, the return to formal address after so long using his Christian name privately, cut deeper than any accusation could have. Marcus insisted there was no excuse for his behavior, but Cecilia interrupted, asking him to confirm her understanding of events. He had found their debate so amusing that he jokingly proposed marriage, never imagining she might accept such an offer from him. When she did accept with genuine happiness, he realized his terrible mistake, but could not bring himself to correct it immediately. So instead, he had allowed her to spend 2 days believing herself beloved, permitted her father to announce their engagement to all of society, and let her plan a future he had no intention of honoring. Marcus confirmed this shameful summary was accurate, and Cecilia told him not to apologize, not to claim he never meant to hurt her, because his intentions were irrelevant compared to the reality of what he had done. She spoke of the humiliation she felt, so profound she could scarcely draw breath. She described how she had told her friends the proposal was romantic, how she had wept with joy because the man she had admired for 2 years had finally seen her as something more than a convenient debating partner. Each word struck Marcus like a physical blow, as understanding finally dawned with terrible clarity. Cecilia had cared for him, truly, cared for him beyond mere friendship. She confirmed what should have been obvious, asking through tears if he thought she had spent all those hours in his company simply to pass the time. She confessed she had been in love with him for months, desperately and foolishly in love with a man who apparently viewed her as little more than entertaining. Companionship. The confession hung between them, raw and painful, and Marcus felt something twist in his chest as he realized what precious thing he had destroyed before even recognizing its existence. The weight of what he had done, the magnitude of the pain he had caused, settled over him like a shroud, and he understood that whatever happened next, whatever choices Cecilia made about their future, he had already lost something irreplaceable. Marcus insisted he had never viewed Cecilia as merely entertainment, that she was his dearest friend, that he valued everything about her more than he could express. If he had failed to recognize his own feelings, if he had been blind to the depth of hers, it was not from lack of regard, but from fear. Fear of examining emotions that terrified him, fear of vulnerability, fear of risking the comfortable friendship they had built. Cecilia demanded to know what he meant by fear, her anger finally breaking through her controlled facade. Was it stupidity, arrogance, the assumption that she with her unfeminine opinions could never be worthy of romantic consideration? Marcus crossed the room without thinking, desperate to make her understand. It was none of those things. He had never allowed himself to consider her romantically, because he valued their friendship too highly to risk it. The women he was expected to marry were insipid, creatures with whom he had nothing in common. Cecilia was different, real and honest and herself. He had placed her in a separate category, thinking he was honoring her, when in truth he was merely protecting himself from examining feelings that frightened him. The question Cecilia asked next cut to the heart of everything. What had he discovered, now that he had been forced to examine those feelings? Marcus offered her the raw truth, uncertain as it was. He had discovered that he was a fool who had nearly destroyed something precious out of sheer blindness, that her absence from his life these past 2 days had been agony, that the thought of hurting her, of causing the pain he now saw in her face, was unbearable, that what he had dismissed as mere friendship might in fact have been love all along, hidden even from himself because he was too cowardly to acknowledge it. For a long moment, Cecilia simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head slowly, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. She whispered that it was too late. Even if what he said was true, even if he did care for her, how could she believe it? How could she trust anything he said after this? He had trapped her in a false engagement, allowed her to parade her happiness before society, while knowing it was all based on a cruel joke. Every word of affection he might speak now was tainted by that deception. She would never know if he meant it, or if he was simply trying to salvage the situation. The truth of her words struck Marcus like a physical blow. She was right. He had destroyed the very foundation on which trust might have been built. Marcus asked quietly what she would have him do, promising to honor any decision she made. Regarding their engagement, if she wished to end it, he would take full public responsibility, would ensure society knew the fault was entirely his, that she was the victim of his thoughtless behavior. Her reputation would be protected as much as possible. But Cecilia laughed again, that same bitter sound that was so unlike her usual warmth. She explained that the moment he withdrew from this engagement, for whatever reason, she became the woman rejected by a duke. Society would speculate endlessly about what deficiency in her caused him to change his mind. She would be pitied, gossiped about, marked as undesirable for any other gentleman of good standing. Marcus repeated his question with growing frustration. What would she have him do? He had confessed the truth because to do otherwise would have been a greater betrayal. He had acknowledged his feelings such as he understood them. He had offered to accept the consequences of his actions. What more could he do? Cecilia told him quietly to leave, to allow her time to consider what she wished to do about this disaster he had created. Whether she chose to end their engagement or continue it, the decision must be hers alone, made without pressure or persuasion from him. Marcus wanted to protest, but recognized the justice in her request. He had taken away her agency once with his careless proposal. The least he could do was allow her to reclaim it now. He agreed that he would await her decision, then paused at the door, needing her to hear one final truth, even if she could not yet believe it. He was truly sorry for the joke, for the deception, for failing to see what was before him until it was too late. She deserved far better than what he had given her. Cecilia did not turn from the window, did not acknowledge his words beyond a slight nod. Marcus let himself out, each step away from her feeling like a small death. 3 weeks passed with no word from Cecilia, and Marcus honored her request for time and space, though it cost him dearly. He did not call at the Montford residence, did not attempt to send notes or gifts, did not try to force a resolution through intermediaries. Instead, he endured the peculiar torture of seeing their engagement announced in newspapers while knowing the truth behind it, of accepting congratulations from acquaintances while uncertainty gnawed at him constantly. Society noticed his absence from Lady Cecilia's side. Speculation ran rampant through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs. Whispers suggested the Duke had developed cold feet, that Lady Cecilia had revealed some deficiency of character, that the engagement was not quite as solid as initially believed. Marcus ignored it all, refusing to provide fuel for gossip through either comment or reaction. But ignoring society did not mean he could ignore the ache of Cecilia's absence from his life. It was remarkable how completely one person could infiltrate every aspect of existence without one's awareness. He would begin to read a political treatise and think Cecilia would have thoughts on this before remembering that her thoughts were no longer. available to him. He would attend parliamentary sessions and find himself composing arguments in his head, anticipating her responses, only to return to an empty house where those conversations could never occur. Eleanor called regularly, providing what news she could glean from her own visits to Lady Cecilia, though she made clear her displeasure at having to play messenger. Cecilia attended functions when she must, but left early. Lady Montfort was beside herself with worry, though Cecilia insisted she was merely fatigued. She did not speak of Marcus, not to condemn, not to defend, not even to acknowledge his existence. It was as though he had become a ghost haunting the edges of her life. Marcus asked the question he always asked, the one he dreaded answering. Had she decided anything? Eleanor replied that if Cecilia had decided, she had not confided it. She told Marcus he looked dreadful, asking when he last ate a proper meal or slept through the night. Marcus claimed he managed adequately, that he could hardly complain of discomfort given what he had inflicted upon Cecilia. Eleanor said tartly that self-flagellation served no purpose, that what he needed was to determine what he truly wanted from this situation, not what honor demanded, not what society expected, but what his own heart desired. Marcus said bitterly that his heart had proven itself remarkably unreliable in matters of any importance. Eleanor told him it was time to become better acquainted with it. Cecilia would make her decision eventually, but when she did, Marcus must be prepared to act on his own convictions rather than simply reacting to hers. He needed to determine what he wanted and be ready to fight for it. That night, unable to sleep, Marcus finally allowed himself to examine his feelings with complete honesty. He loved Cecilia, not merely as a friend, not simply as an intellectual companion, but with the full depth of romantic attachment he had so carefully avoided acknowledging. He loved her wit and her passion, her fearlessness and her compassion. He loved the way she challenged him, provoked him, made him think beyond his comfortable assumptions. He loved her laughter, her intelligence, even her stubborn refusal to moderate her opinions to suit social expectations. He loved her, and through his own foolishness, he had destroyed any chance of her believing it. The answer came on a Tuesday morning in the form of Lord Montfort himself, appearing at Blackridge House with an expression suggesting the visit was as uncomfortable for him as it would prove for Marcus. Montfort apologized for calling without notice, but said circumstances required immediate discussion. Marcus's stomach dropped as he asked if Lady Cecilia had made a decision regarding their engagement. She had. She wished to continue with the betrothal and proceed toward marriage. However, Montfort paused, clearly struggling with what he must say next. Certain difficulties had arisen between them. Cecilia would not elaborate on their nature, but she requested that the engagement period be extended to allow more time for preparation. Relief and confusion warred within Marcus. She was continuing the engagement, but under what terms? What understanding? Montfort's expression grew even more uncomfortable as he consulted a note. Cecilia specified that she expected a courtship period during which Marcus would demonstrate appropriate attention and regard consistent with genuine affection. Montfort confessed his puzzlement at this stipulation, asking if there was some reason his daughter doubted Marcus's affection. The question hung heavy in the air. Marcus could lie, could claim simple premarital nerves, but Montfort deserved better than further deception. There had been a misunderstanding between them regarding the nature of his original proposal, Marcus explained carefully. Lady Cecilia had reason to question the sincerity of his regard, and she was giving him opportunity to demonstrate it through his actions rather than words. He believed this was an entirely reasonable request. Montfort studied him for a long moment with shrewd eyes, seeing more than Marcus would have preferred. He said he trusted Marcus would rise to this challenge, that his daughter was extraordinarily dear to him. If Marcus harbored doubts about this union, now was the time to voice them. He would rather dissolve the engagement now than watch Cecilia enter an unhappy marriage. Marcus said firmly that he had no doubts, that he would meet Lady Cecilia's expectations and prove himself worthy of her regard. He had Montfort's word on this. After Montfort departed, Marcus sat alone with this unexpected development. Cecilia was giving him a chance, not forgiveness, not trust, but opportunity. She would continue the engagement, allow him proximity, but she would make him earn every scrap of her regard. It was more than he deserved and less than he wanted, but it was something. He would not waste it. His first opportunity came that evening at the Peyton soiree, one of the season's major social events. Marcus arrived deliberately late, knowing Cecilia would already be in attendance. He spotted her across the crowded ballroom, dressed in sapphire silk that made her dark eyes seem even more luminous. She was speaking with a young gentleman Marcus vaguely recognized as Lord James Ashford, and her laugh, that warm, genuine laugh he had not heard in weeks, struck him like a blow. She had laughed for Ashford, but not for him. The recognition stung, but Marcus forced himself to observe rather than react. He approached carefully, not wishing to startle her. Cecilia's expression shuddered instantly upon seeing him, the laughter dying from her eyes. She greeted him with perfect politeness and complete emotional distance, expressing surprise to see him there. Marcus said quietly that he could not miss the opportunity to see her, that it had been too long. Cecilia replied coolly that 3 weeks was hardly an eternity, though she understood time passed differently for some than others. Lord Ashford, clearly sensing undercurrents beyond his understanding, made his excuses and withdrew. Marcus stepped closer while maintaining proper distance. He said he received her decision through her father and thanked her for giving him this chance. Cecilia told him not to thank her yet. She had not forgiven him. She had merely decided that dissolving their engagement would cause more harm than continuing it, to both their reputations and to her father's satisfaction. But this was a business arrangement now, not a love match. He wished to avoid marriage based on false sentiment, so his wish was granted. The words were knives, each one finding its mark. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced. He called at the Montford residence daily, always properly chaperoned, bringing flowers that Cecilia accepted with polite thanks and no visible pleasure. He escorted her to exhibitions and concerts where she maintained perfect propriety and emotional distance. Lord Ashford called often as well, and Cecilia seemed to enjoy his company far more than Marcus's, laughing at his jokes, engaging with his observations, showing the warmth and animation she denied Marcus. Whether she did this deliberately to wound him, or whether Ashford simply pleased her more, Marcus could not determine, but watching another man make Cecilia smile was its own form of torture. The breakthrough came unexpectedly at the Carlisle ball. Marcus had been standing near the refreshment table, watching Cecilia dance with Lord Ashford for the 3rd time that evening when he overheard 2 society matrons discussing the poor Duke of Blackridge, trapped by his own careless words into an engagement with a woman entirely unsuitable for his station. One could hardly blame him for looking so miserable at these events. Her companion agreed that Cecilia was pretty enough, but far too opinionated for a duchess, suggesting Lady Cecilia would alienate half of society with her forward views within a month. The first woman lowered her voice conspiratorially, but not enough. She had heard he only proposed as a jest, and that Cecilia deliberately trapped him by accepting publicly before he could clarify. Quite calculating of her, really, though one supposed she had little other prospect of such an advantageous match, given her unfortunate temperament. Marcus moved before conscious thought intervened, his blood running cold with a protective rage so pure it consumed everything else, and what he did next would change everything between them forever. Marcus approached the gossiping women with an expression that made them visibly blanch, his voice dangerously quiet as he informed them that he could not help but overhear their fascinating discussion of his private affairs. He proceeded to correct several egregious misunderstandings with a precision that left no room for interpretation. Lady Cecilia Montford was the most remarkable woman of his acquaintance, brilliant, compassionate, and fearless in her convictions. If she was opinionated, it was because she possessed opinions worth hearing, unlike those who filled their hours with malicious speculation about their betters. His proposal, far from being a trap, was the most genuine expression of admiration he had ever made, though he had bungled the execution badly enough to require an extended courtship to prove himself worthy of her regard. The fault in their engagement lay entirely with him, not with Lady Cecilia, who had done nothing but respond with grace to his clumsy overtures. Marcus suggested that if they found themselves with excess time for gossip, perhaps they might consider directing their energies toward the charitable causes Lady Cecilia supported. These were the concerns that occupied her thoughts, rather than the petty social machinations that seemed to consume lesser minds. The silence that followed his speech extended far beyond the two mortified women. The music had stopped, dancers stood frozen. Every eye in the ballroom had fixed upon him. He had just publicly defended Cecilia with a passion that left no doubt about the authenticity of his feelings, had revealed his own culpability in their troubled engagement, and had insulted two prominent society matrons in the process. It was spectacularly undiplomatic, utterly inappropriate, and exactly the sort of thing Cecilia herself might have done in his position. Marcus turned to find Cecilia standing near the dance floor, Lord Ashford forgotten at her side. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes showed something he had not seen since before his confession. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first stirrings of hope. He crossed to her, aware that every person in the ballroom watched, that this moment would be dissected in drawing rooms throughout London for weeks. He no longer cared. Let them watch. Let them gossip. The only opinion that mattered stood before him. Marcus asked if she would walk with him in the gardens, knowing the request was highly improper given the late hour and their strained circumstances, but needing desperately to speak with her away from this sea of judgmental eyes. Cecilia studied him for a long moment, then nodded, informing Lord Ashford she would return shortly and ignoring his expression of concern as she accepted Marcus's arm. They walked in silence through the ballroom, through the crowded entrance hall, and out into the torchlit gardens where other couples strolled at careful, chaperoned distances. Marcus led her to a more secluded section where a stone bench sat beneath an ancient oak, far enough from the house that their conversation would not be overheard, but close enough to maintain minimal propriety. Cecilia spoke. First, asking if he realized what he had just done, that by tomorrow morning all of London would know he defended her by publicly acknowledging his own failures and insulting two of society's most prolific gossips. Marcus said he knew precisely what he had done and would do it again without hesitation. He could not stand there and allow them to malign her character, to suggest she had trapped him through calculation when the truth was exactly the opposite. She had been honest and open in her affection while he had been blind and careless. If anyone in this engagement bore the weight of shame, it was him. Cecilia said softly that he did not need to make grand gestures or public declarations to prove his sincerity. Marcus insisted it was not theater. When he heard them speak of her with such contempt, dismissing her intelligence and compassion as unfortunate temperament, suggesting she had manipulated him, he felt a rage so pure and protective that responding was instinct rather than strategy. He could no more have remained silent than he could have stopped breathing. He continued, the words flowing now without rehearsal or calculation. For weeks he had tried to demonstrate his feelings through proper courtship, flowers and calls and polite conversation. But that was not who they were to each other. They had never been proper or conventional. Their friendship was built on passionate debate, on challenging each other, on refusing to accept easy answers or comfortable lies. He told her that he loved her, not the careful, measured affection appropriate to an engagement, but something far more consuming and terrifying. He loved her brilliance and her stubbornness, her compassion and her righteous fury. He loved the way she demolished his arguments and made him think beyond his comfortable assumptions. He loved that she refused to moderate herself to suit society's expectations, that she fought for justice even when it would be easier to remain silent. Marcus admitted he had been afraid to acknowledge these feelings, afraid of the vulnerability they required, the risk of rejection, the loss of control over his carefully ordered life. So he had hidden behind the safe label of friendship, convinced himself that intellectual companionship was enough, that romantic love was for other people with their messy emotions and irrational behavior. But these past weeks without her, watching her laugh with other men while maintaining careful distance from him, facing the very real possibility that he had destroyed something precious beyond recovery, that had taught him that safety was worthless if it meant losing her. He would rather risk everything, endure any humiliation, than return to that hollow existence where he protected his pride at the cost of genuine connection. He asked simply if there was any chance she might forgive him, might allow him to truly court her. Cecilia was crying, tears tracking silver down her cheeks in the torchlight. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. She told him she wanted to forgive him. That part of her had begun to forgive him the moment he confessed the truth, rather than allowing her to persist in false belief. That took courage, even if the initial deception had been cowardly. But she said forgiveness was not the same as restored trust. Trust was not given through grand declarations or passionate speeches. Trust was earned slowly through consistent action, through proving over time that words matched deeds, that professed feelings manifested in genuine care and attention. Marcus agreed completely and promised that was exactly what he would do. Cecilia smiled then, the first genuine smile she had given him since before his confession. She said she thought one grand gesture was acceptable, that defending her against gossips while publicly taking responsibility for his failures was quite satisfactory as romantic gestures went. Relief and joy surged through Marcus so powerfully he felt momentarily dizzy with it. He asked if he might kiss her, then immediately apologized for the presumptuous question given their circumstances. But Cecilia said yes, one kiss here in the garden where no one could see, to seal this new understanding between them. Nothing more until he had properly earned her complete trust. Marcus stepped closer, his hands gentle as they framed her face, thumbs brushing away tears. He kissed her softly, carefully, trying to convey through touch what words had failed to express. Apology and promise, regret and hope, the depth of feeling he was still learning to acknowledge. Cecilia's hands came up to rest against his chest, and for a moment she kissed him back, allowing herself to show the affection she had been carefully guarding. Then she pulled away, breathless, telling him that was quite enough for tonight. They should return before they were missed, before scandal truly erupted. Marcus agreed, though releasing her required more willpower than he would have believed possible. The weeks that followed brought a transformation in their relationship that was subtle, but profound. True to his word, Marcus made no more grand gestures or elaborate declarations. Instead, he focused on consistency, showing up, paying attention, demonstrating through small daily actions that his regard was genuine and enduring. He brought not expensive gifts, but thoughtful tokens, a pamphlet on factory reform he thought would interest her, a newspaper article about women's education, a lavender sachet when he noticed her previous one had faded. He listened. When she spoke, truly listened, remembering the things she told him and referencing them in later conversations to show his attention was genuine. When they attended social functions together, Marcus made no effort to monopolize her time. Instead, he remained available but not oppressive, allowing Cecilia to engage with others while ensuring she knew he was present should she need or want him. He defended her publicly when necessary, cutting off gossip with a look, redirecting conversation when someone made dismissive comments about women's intelligence, but without making a show of it. Most importantly, he showed her his own vulnerabilities. He confessed his doubts about parliamentary debates before they occurred. He admitted when he felt out of his depth in social situations. He shared his conflicts about ducal responsibilities and personal desires. He allowed her to see not the polished facade of the Duke, but Marcus, uncertain, flawed, human. Cecilia responded slowly, like a flower opening to sunlight after a long frost. Her guardedness gradually eased, her smiles became more frequent and genuine. She began seeking him out in crowds rather than merely accepting his presence. Most tellingly, her laughter returned. Not the polite social laughter she produced for others, but her real laugh, warm and unrestrained. One afternoon in early March, as they strolled through Hyde Park with Cecilia's maid trailing at a discreet distance, she suddenly slipped her hand into his arm with a naturalness that suggested she had stopped thinking of the gesture as significant or symbolic. She said she had been thinking about what he said on the Carlisle terrace, about loving her because she made him feel alive. Marcus's heart began beating faster, but he kept his voice steady, confirming that every word was true. Cecilia said quietly that she believed that now, not because he had said it repeatedly, but because she saw it in how he looked at her, how he listened, how he remembered small details she mentioned. Love was not in declarations, but in attention, in the choice to show up day after day, even when nothing particularly exciting was happening. Marcus agreed that was precisely it. Cecilia stopped walking, turning to face him fully. She said she must confess something to him. She had been so focused on whether she could trust him, on protecting herself from further hurt, that she failed to acknowledge something important. She still loved him. She never stopped loving him. Even when she was angry and wounded, even when she tried to convince herself that what she felt was merely the remnant of foolish infatuation, she loved him. And that terrified her because love made one so dreadfully vulnerable. Joy flooded through Marcus so intensely he felt dizzy with it. But Cecilia held up her hand, telling him to let her finish. She was choosing to be vulnerable with him, choosing to trust that the man she saw before her, the one who had shown up every day for weeks, who listened and remembered and shared his own fears, was the real him. Not the man who made that terrible joke, but also not some perfect, ideal. Just Marcus, flawed and human and trying his best. That man she could love. That man she did love. Marcus felt his own eyes sting with tears, an unfamiliar sensation for someone who prided himself on emotional control. He told her roughly that she was the bravest person he knew, that after everything he did that she could still, his voice broke and he tried again, thanking her for this chance, for her trust, for her love, promising to honor all of it every day for the rest of their lives. Cecilia said simply that she knew he would. Then, with characteristic directness that made him love her even more, she asked if he was going to kiss her properly, or must she wait until after the wedding? Marcus laughed, surprised and delighted, and so full of feeling he could barely contain it, asking if she meant here in Hyde Park where anyone might see. Cecilia confirmed, saying, "Let society see that they were genuinely, ridiculously in love. Let them gossip about the Duke kissing his betrothed with improper enthusiasm in a public park." She no longer cared what they thought. Neither did Marcus, and he drew her into his arms. The kiss was everything he had imagined and more, tender and passionate, tentative and confident, an apology and a promise all at once. Cecilia's arms came up around his neck, her fingers threading through his hair, and Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him. This was right. This was real. This was love freely given and gratefully received. When they finally parted, both breathing quickly, Cecilia's cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. She said that was rather better than she anticipated, and Marcus teased about needing extensive practice to improve his performance, and Cecilia agreed that extensive practice sounded agreeable. Then she grew more serious, saying she wanted their wedding soon, not because she feared he would change his mind, but because she did not wish to wait any longer to begin their life together. Could they move the date forward, perhaps to April? Marcus repeated the word, happiness expanding in his chest, agreeing immediately and saying he would speak with her father about arrangements. Cecilia interrupted, placing a finger over his lips, saying this was their wedding, not her father's or society's. She wanted something relatively simple and intimate, just family and close friends. She wanted to marry him, not perform a spectacle for society. Marcus promised her anything she wished, and as they resumed walking with hands joined openly, Cecilia's maid discreetly pretending not to have witnessed the kiss, Marcus felt lighter than he had in months. Cecilia loved him. She trusted him. They would marry not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to build a life together. The spring afternoon stretched golden around them, and Marcus understood with perfect clarity that what had begun as disaster had somehow transformed into the greatest gift of his life, and April could not come soon enough. The wedding took place on a brilliant April morning at the chapel of Ashford Manor, the ancestral estate where Marcus had spent his childhood summers and where he had always imagined the most important moments of his life would unfold. True to Cecilia's wishes, it was an intimate affair, perhaps 50 guests in total, mostly family and close friends who had witnessed their tumultuous journey from friendship to disaster to genuine love. The chapel was decorated simply with spring flowers, daffodils and tulips, and of course lavender, filling the air with a delicate fragrance that would forever after remind Marcus of this perfect day. Marcus stood at the altar in his finest coat, his hands remarkably steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Eleanor stood to one side, her smile gentle and knowing, having played no small part in forcing her brother to confront truths he had been too blind to see. His mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, looking pleased despite her earlier protestations about the small guest list and simple arrangements. Then the music began, and Cecilia appeared at the chapel entrance on her father's arm, and Marcus forgot to breathe. She wore a gown of ivory silk with delicate lace at the sleeves and neckline, her dark hair arranged in soft curls with small white roses tucked among them. She carried a simple bouquet of lavender and moved with a grace that seemed to illuminate the entire chapel, but it was her expression that struck Marcus most powerfully. The joy and certainty in her eyes as she looked at him, the smile that held no reservations or doubts, only happiness and the quiet confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and had chosen it freely. Lord Montfort placed Cecilia's hand in Marcus's, with a look that conveyed both blessing and warning, a father entrusting his most precious treasure to another man's care with the understanding that this gift must be honored and cherished above all else. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of sacred words and solemn promises. Marcus spoke his vows with complete conviction, meaning every word about love and honor and cherishing Cecilia for all their days. When Cecilia spoke hers, her voice clear and steady, Marcus felt tears prick his eyes at the magnitude of what she was giving him. Herself, her trust, her future, her heart that he had so carelessly wounded, and that she was now offering again with a courage that left him humbled. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus pulled Cecilia into his arms and kissed her with all the love and gratitude he felt, heedless of their audience, too focused on the woman in his arms, his wife, his partner, his love. The wedding breakfast that followed was a joyful affair marked by excellent food, abundant champagne, and numerous toasts. Lord Montfort spoke movingly about his daughter's happiness and his confidence in her future. Eleanor teased Marcus mercilessly about his obvious infatuation, reminding everyone present of how blind he had been to his own feelings. The Dowager Duchess offered advice about managing ducal households that had both Marcus and Cecilia suppressing laughter at its outdated formality. But the moment that stayed with Marcus most powerfully came late in the afternoon, after most guests had departed, when he and Cecilia were finally alone in the gardens of Ashford Manor. They walked together in the spring sunshine, Cecilia's hand tucked into his arm, both of them still in their wedding finery, simply being together without performance or pretense. Marcus asked if she was happy, though he could see the answer in every line of her face, in the way she moved closer to him, in the contentment that radiated from her very being. Cecilia confirmed she was extraordinarily so, then with characteristic honesty added that she never imagined when he made that ridiculous joke at the Hartley dinner that it would lead to real love and genuine partnership. It had seemed like such a disaster at the time, the worst possible beginning to any relationship. Marcus agreed ruefully that it was indeed a disaster, that he had been an absolute fool, and Cecilia cheerfully confirmed this assessment while adding that he had learned from his foolishness, had grown, and changed, and that was all any of them could do. Recognize mistakes and endeavor to do better. He had done that remarkably well, she said, but only because she had given him the chance. Marcus stopped walking to face her fully, telling her seriously that she could have walked away, could have protected herself by ending the engagement and never risking her heart with him again. That she chose otherwise, that she chose to trust him despite every reason not to. That was the greatest gift he had ever received. Cecilia's eyes sparkled with humor and affection as she replied that someone had to reform him, that he was becoming insufferably arrogant with all that ducal authority going to his head, and she considered it her civic duty to take him in hand. Marcus laughed, pulling her close and saying he was grateful for her sense of civic responsibility, though he must warn her that he would require regular reminding not to become insufferable again, as it was an ongoing struggle. Cecilia promised to be vigilant, then more softly told. She loved him, not despite his flaws, but including them. He was imperfect and occasionally idiotic, and she loved him completely, every frustrating, wonderful part of him. Marcus said roughly, his voice thick with emotion, that he loved her, that she was brilliant and stubborn and the best thing that had ever happened to him, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve her. Cecilia said simply that he already did, that he showed up, he tried, he cared, and that was enough. That was everything. They kissed again there in the gardens of their home, as the spring afternoon stretched long and golden around them, and Marcus understood that this was not the ending of their story, but the beginning, the first page of a life they would write together, marked by debate and laughter and genuine partnership, built on a foundation of hard-won trust and unconditional love. The months that followed brought adjustments and discoveries, as Marcus and Cecilia learned to navigate married life together. They divided their time between the London townhouse during parliamentary sessions and Ashford Manor in the countryside, where Cecilia threw herself into learning estate management with the same fierce intelligence she brought to everything else. She had not been exaggerating when she said she expected to be a true partner in all aspects of their life. She attended meetings with tenants, reviewed account books, made suggestions for improvements that Marcus found invariably sensible and often brilliant. The estate manager, initially skeptical of a duchess involving herself in such matters, became one of her strongest advocates within months. In London, Cecilia became deeply involved in the reform movements she had always championed. She worked with organizations supporting factory workers, particularly women and children, using her new position as Duchess to open doors that had been closed to her before. Marcus found himself drawn into these efforts, his initial involvement motivated primarily by supporting his wife gradually transforming into genuine commitment as he witnessed firsthand the conditions she had been describing during their early debates. He sponsored legislation in Parliament, used his influence to pressure factory owners, discovered that using his privilege for meaningful change brought far more satisfaction than he had ever found in social advancement or political maneuvering. Their debates continued as passionate and spirited as ever, but now they took place in the privacy of their home rather than at society functions, late-night conversations in the library where they challenged each other's positions, refined their arguments, occasionally convinced each other to modify their views. These discussions often ended with laughter or kisses or both, the intellectual intimacy they had always shared now enhanced by emotional and physical connection. Eleanor observed during a family dinner that she had never seen her brother so alive, so genuinely engaged with the world around him, and Marcus could not deny it. Cecilia had awakened something in him that he had not even realized was sleeping. 2 years into their marriage, on a bright morning in late spring, Marcus sat on the nursery floor of Ashford Manor, a position that would have horrified him in his former life, watching his wife attempt to coax their 11-month-old son Thomas to take his first steps. The baby, who had inherited his mother's dark hair and his father's brown eyes along with what appeared to be a combination of both their stubborn natures, regarded Cecilia seriously for a moment before promptly sitting down with a decisive thump and beginning to examine his toes instead. Marcus tried not to laugh at Cecilia's exasperated expression as she abandoned her efforts in favor of scooping Thomas up for a kiss. She declared that their son had absolutely inherited Marcus's tendency to do things in his own time and on his own terms, and Marcus protested while simultaneously recognizing the truth in her observation. Thomas was indeed a perfect combination of both of them, Cecilia's intensity and his determination, her warmth and his reserve, her quick emotions and his thoughtful consideration. Watching Cecilia with their son, seeing the patience and love she brought to motherhood, Marcus felt the same overwhelming gratitude that struck him daily, that this was his life, that he had been given this extraordinary gift of family and partnership that he had come so close to, throwing it all away through his own blindness, and had been offered a second chance he had done nothing to deserve. Cecilia received a letter from Marcus's mother that morning, she told him, and the Dowager Duchess was already making subtle inquiries about potential matches for Thomas. Marcus was aghast, pointing out that their son was not yet a year old and could not even walk, and Cecilia's eyes sparkled with mischief as she said she had informed his mother they would not be entertaining such discussions until Thomas was at least 3. The Dowager had been most put out by this lack of maternal ambition, but Cecilia was firm. They would let Thomas choose his own path, make his own mistakes, find his own way, just as they had done, even if that path led him to propose to someone as a joke at a dinner party, though she would certainly counsel him about clarity in courtship. They stood together in the nursery, sunlight warming them, their son babbling contentedly between them, and Marcus said quietly that he loved them both, more than he ever imagined possible. Cecilia replied that she loved him too, even when he was being insufferable, which was still rather frequently, and Marcus promised to endeavor to be less insufferable. But Cecilia told him not to, that she had grown quite fond of his particular brand of insufferability, that it kept life interesting. Thomas chose that moment to grab both their faces with his small hands, making a sound of imperious demand that suggested he felt neglected, and they laughed together, turning their attention to this small person they had created, this manifestation of their love. Later that afternoon, after the nurse had taken Thomas for his nap, Marcus and Cecilia retreated to the library for their customary tea and resumed a political debate they had been conducting for the past week about proposed education reforms. Their voices rose and fell in familiar patterns, argument and counter-argument, passion and logic, the intellectual dance that had first drawn them together and that still formed such a vital part of their relationship. Cecilia accused him of being deliberately obtuse, and Marcus countered that he was being realistic, and she shot back that his realism was simply cynicism dressed in pragmatic clothing. They continued in this vein for another hour, thoroughly enjoying themselves until Cecilia suddenly paused and asked if he remembered when they first met, that tea where she was debating Lord Thornbury. Marcus confirmed he remembered, how she had demolished Thornbury's arguments so thoroughly that the man avoided her at social functions for months afterward. Cecilia confessed she had been terribly nervous, that she knew Marcus was watching and so wanted to impress him, that even then she thought she was a little bit in love with him, though she would never have admitted it. Marcus felt his heart constrict with tenderness as he told her he had been captivated, had told himself it was merely intellectual appreciation, but Eleanor claimed she knew even then that he was lying to himself about his feelings. Cecilia agreed that Eleanor was insufferably perceptive, though they should be grateful for her interference, for if she had not forced Marcus to confront his feelings after that disastrous confession, he might have let pride keep them apart. Marcus acknowledged this truth as he crossed to where Cecilia sat, pulling her to her feet and into his arms, saying he had been a fool about many things back then, but was trying very hard not to be a fool anymore. Cecilia assured him he was succeeding admirably, though she did have one complaint about their current arrangement. Marcus asked what that was, and she said that after 2 years of marriage she still won the majority of their debates, that he really must improve his argumentation skills. She was beginning to suspect he sometimes conceded points simply to please her. Marcus laughed, delighted as always by her competitive nature, admitting he was guilty as charged, though in his defense, watching her celebrate her victories with such enthusiasm was its own reward. Cecilia called this flattery, but she was smiling, saying she would accept his inferior debating skills as evidence of his devotion, but she drew the line at him pretending to lose at chess. That was simply insulting to them both. Marcus protested indignantly that he had never pretended to lose at chess, that she was genuinely better at it than he was, and Cecilia said smugly that she knew, she just wanted to hear him admit it. They spent the rest of the afternoon in comfortable companionship, reading and talking and simply being together. And Marcus reflected that this was what he had almost lost through his own carelessness. Not just Cecilia's love, but her friendship, her presence, the simple joy of sharing life with someone who understood and challenged and cherished him. As evening fell and they prepared to dress for dinner, a small gathering of close friends they were hosting, Marcus caught Cecilia's reflection in the mirror and was struck anew by his extraordinary fortune. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was herself, brilliant and passionate and uncompromising, and his. Cecilia noticed his stare and asked what he was thinking, and Marcus said it was nothing, though it was everything. He was simply thinking how grateful he was for that ridiculous joke at the Hartley dinner, for the disaster that became the best thing that ever happened to him. Cecilia's expression softened as she came to stand beside him, taking his hand and saying she was grateful for it too, for the joke, for the misunderstanding, for the pain that forced them both to confront what they truly felt. All of it led them here, to this life, this love, this family they were building together. Marcus agreed simply that yes, all of it led them here. And standing together in the soft light of evening, hands joined and hearts aligned, they moved forward into their future, not perfect, never perfect, but genuine and hard-won and entirely their own. The journey from thoughtless jest to true love had been long and painful, marked by betrayal and forgiveness, pride and humility, blindness and revelation. But it had taught them both something invaluable: that love worth having was love worth fighting for, that trust once broken could be rebuilt stronger than before, that the greatest gifts often came disguised as disasters, and that sometimes the person standing right beside you, the friend you thought you knew completely, was actually the love of your life waiting to be recognized. Marcus had learned to see with his heart instead of just his mind, and Cecilia had learned that vulnerability was not weakness, but the greatest courage of all. And together they had created something neither could have built alone: a partnership of equals. A love story that began with a lie, but became the truest thing. In either of their lives,